As you know, I'm Julie Beckett. I am the parent of a young adult with severe disabilities. Katie is now 32 years old, but spent the first 3 years of her life in a pediatric intensive care unit in our home-based hospital, St. Luke's in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And Katie was contracted viral encephalitis at 5.5 months of age, ended up having a grand mal seizure. The encephalitis moved down the spinal column and attacked the central nervous system and put her into a coma. When she woke up 2.5 weeks later, she was totally paralyzed. And the most affected was her breathing, her swallowing, the tip of her tongue, and her left shoulder. Katie has made tremendous progress. She made good strides in returning and recovering some of her disabilities in the beginning. However, again, the breathing and the swallowing were probably her most difficult things to overcome. Her diaphragm is basically paralyzed. Her phrenic nerve has been damaged on her left side. We tried phrenic nerve pacemakers. It didn't seem to work. However, those phrenic nerve pacemakers may have inspired her to do some breathing. It was just shortly after her second birthday in the hospital that that the doctors approached us about taking her home. We thought everything was fine, but we realized that in the first 2 years of her hospitalization, we had used our $1 million major medical coverage on Blue Cross Blue Shield, and the only thing we really basically had was basic coverage. Katie had been placed on Social Security under the Supplemental Security Income Program because she was living in that hospital and not living at home. So Mark's my income did not count, even though we didn't have a tremendous income. He was working for my father as an accountant at his lumber wholesale business, and I was a 7th and 8th grade social studies teacher. Being said, as a 7th and 8th grade social studies teacher, that's easy enough to know. You get up in 8th grade and you talk to 8th graders about government and how important government is and what you do when you have a problem with the government. Well, clearly we had a problem with the government because if Katie came home from the hospital, they would not let Medicaid extend to home care, and that's what we needed since she had no health insurance. We didn't know how long it would be before she came back to the hospital. We knew that she'd have to come back, and when she did have a major episode of pneumonia or bronchitis or anything, it would take weeks for her to get over it, and so we could easily run up $25,000, $30,000 bill that we would not be able to afford to pay. And so we needed to figure out something. We then decided to approach our congressman about writing an exception to policy, which was something you could do back then. And so we worked for months on writing an exception to policy to Medicaid rules that would allow, we asked for them to allow Medicaid to continue to pay for home care, and we would take Katie home, ventilator and all. Katie was now, at that point, after 3 years, she was still 16 to 18 hours out of 24 hours on a vent, and still being fed through a gastrostomy tube, and needed multiple medications and a lot of chest percussion treatments, etc., just to keep her healthy. She was able to come home because we were able to get the exception to policy, but not without a great deal of to-do. Our congressman hand-walked our request through the Department of Health and Human Services and was denied our request. He then got on a plane with Vice President then George H.W. Bush, who was head of the Regulatory Reform Commission, and it was a regulation that upheld that they could not pay for home care. Medicaid would not pay for home care. And so he hand-delivered the letter to the Vice President, talked about her all the way back to Iowa on Air Force 2, talking to the Vice President about how important this was, but also how important it was for other kids, that Katie couldn't have been the only one there. If we were in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, you knew that in larger cities and in larger states there were multiple kids like this, and it was costing the federal government a bunch of money, and we weren't using that funding quite as well as we should. So that's why we decided at the end of, he decided, the Vice President decided at the end of the flight back to Washington, D.C., that the President needed to be involved. So President Reagan was in his office when the Vice President came in, threw Tom's letter basically on the desk and said, "We need to do something about this, Mr. President." They talked for about an hour, and then it was decided that the head of Medicaid would be contacted, and she was to find this little girl and fix the problem. She knew that if anybody is Medicaid eligible, that you can't give one Medicaid client something you don't give somebody else. So they needed to find Katie, but also come up with a way to help other kids and families who may be in these similar circumstances. We had a lot of news coverage. The day that the Vice President and President talked, it was Veterans Day. The day after, the President held a press conference, and Katie's name came up. He never called her by name. He just took the circumstances from the letter. The doctors felt she'd do better at home. Her parents wanted her home, and it would cost the federal government 1/6 of the current cost that the federal government was paying to keep her out in the hospital as opposed to out and at home. It was determined that, and then all the news media coverage came. You know, we had CBS for breakfast, NBC for lunch, ABC for dinner. Thank heaven CNN wasn't around, or we probably would have been really crazy. We talked to numerous newspapers and all of that. Like I said, I was teaching 7th and 8th grade, and thank heavens my principal just said, "Julie, you need to go to the hospital and take care of this because I have 540 other kids in this school, and I can't be answering questions about Katie." So I went back to the hospital and fielded most of the questions from there. On Thursday, I went back to school, and wouldn't you know, the secretary decided to formally release Katie Beckett from the hospital, and it started all over again. But we were asked to be on Good Morning America that Friday morning, and that's where the whole thing comes from, is that we flew into Chicago. We're sitting in an empty studio, Mark and I. We're talking to a camera that Joan London was on the other end of, and talking about how this had happened and how exciting it was, and that the President had talked to us the night before, and all the wonderful things that happened, that had happened to us. And at that same time, there were numerous families, over 200 families, who called the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C., and explained that they had a kid like Katie. Could they help them too? And because the Medicaid person, head of Medicaid, had been so indulged in understanding the whole ramifications of what they were about to do, they had put together a Katie Beckett board that then determined how these kids got home. They stayed in the parameters, delivering a plan of care, writing up the kinds of things that they would need, making sure the services were available, and that the families really wanted their children home. And of course, they wouldn't have applied for this if they hadn't wanted them home. It was determined after a year that that no longer was fiscally feasible to just have this Katie Beckett board. 214 cases, took them almost 3 years to clear them. And so at the end of the second year, they came up with a program where states could apply on behalf of their citizens with disabilities who were stuck in institutions and really wanted to get home. And so that's where the story ends. There are 1 million people home on Katie Beckett's program right now. It's a Medicaid home and community-based waiver program. Some states call them Katie Beckett programs. It doesn't really matter whether you care about it or not. Right now, we now have more help for families. There are family-to-family health information centers in each of the states, of which we have wonderful families working with other families to help decide what is the best path for their kids and their families. And now with healthcare reform, and we're very excited about healthcare reform, it needed to happen when Katie came home from the hospital. So it's not been a big hurry kind of healthcare reform thing. This is an absolutely dynamic and very particularly important time in our life, and we're very thrilled with it. It will take us a lot of work, but we have several years to get it all right. It's not going to all be right to begin with, but by the end of this planning time, 2014, we should really be able to have an adequate system of affordable health care for all. And with that, thank Thank you very much.